Greetings, everyone. Rob Chassner here, continuing in our study of the Gospel of Matthew, and we're in Matthew chapter 20. So if you're following along, we're going to be discussing the first 16 verses of Matthew chapter 20. Verse 1 in chapter 20 begins with the word for. Now, you don't begin a new conversation, nor do you introduce a new topic or subject by using the word for or the word because. These are words which we use to bring somebody to attention that we are about to validate what we have just said, or that we're going to further discuss or prove those things we just said. And so when Jesus says for the kingdom, he's not introducing something new, but rather he's alerting us to the fact that what he is about to say is going to lend an explanation or credibility to that which has already been said. Now, what is it that Jesus was just speaking about in Matthew chapter 19? Remember, Jesus had an interesting encounter with a very successful and influential young man in the community. He is smart, he's moral, and essentially he comes to Christ and says, I have conquered this world, and I am now interested in turning my focus to conquer the world to come. And what must I do in order that I might have eternal life? Give me a list of things in which I must do in order to attain eternal salvation. And you remember Jesus turned to this guy and he said, keep these commandments. And this guy answered, well, you know, there's 613 commandments in the Old Testament. Which ones of these need my attention? And Jesus referred him to Leviticus 19:18, which says, love your neighbor as yourself. He takes him to the 10 commandments and gives him numbers 6, 7, 8, and 9. And the guy responds, well, I've done all of those things. What else is there? Then Jesus says, well, go home and liquidate all of those things that you own and give everything to the poor, then come and follow me. And even though this young man was a moral man, he was an idolater. Jesus was putting his finger on the idolatry of this man's heart. The first commandment is, I am the only God, and there shall be no other gods before me. The 10th commandment says you should not covet. And so the guy was coveting stuff, and this guy did not have great possessions, but rather his possessions had him. And Jesus is saying to this selfish, greedy, moral man, you liquidate your assets, get rid of the false gods in your life, come and follow me, and you'll have treasure in the world to come. Now remember that Peter lights up when he hears this word treasures, and as the rich ruler is walking away, the rich young ruler, Peter says to Jesus, we have been here with you, following you for 3 years, and I haven't heard of any treasure as it relates to us. We have done what this other guy was unwilling to do, and Peter's asking, well, what's in it for me? What's in it for us, the 12 disciples? Remember that Jesus said, whatever your devotion to me has cost you, you're going to be paid back 100 times in the ages to come. And we know what Peter said, but if it appears that Peter was questioning the fairness of God, after all, Peter and the other 11 disciples have been faithful to follow Jesus for over 3 years, and he has not mentioned treasure to them. Then all of a sudden, this new guy, the rich young ruler, comes about out of left field, and Jesus says to him that you're going to have treasure. Peter jumps up and says, well, where's our treasure? What's in it for us? Then Jesus says, the first are going to be last, and the last are going to be first. Human nature has a tendency to challenge God. We blame God for all those things in our life which are not right. we make poor decisions and we have bad things happen, and then we end up blaming God. Israel was told by God, I'm going to give you this land of milk and honey, and this is how I want you to live your life. And if you live your life in this way, you will live a long time in this land, and you will have a very prosperous life. And if you live your life this way, you'll be in this land for a very long time. And so God established the land, and he planted his people in the land of milk and honey. Yet once the people began to prosper, like we often do, and this is human nature, we get full of ourselves and we think that we know more than God, and we begin to do life our way. And God told them, if you do that, the land is going to vomit you out. And sure enough, here come the Babylonians. They ripped God's people out of the land and took them to Babylonia for 70 years. Now, when you're in a place for 70 years, you're going to have children and grandchildren born. And you know what happens. They build synagogues there. The junior goes down to the Bible school and studies the Old Testament, and he comes back and he says to mom and dad or grandpa, grandmom, hey, we learned in synagogue today that we're supposed to be in the promised land. We're not supposed to be here in Babylon. Why aren't we there? And the correct answer for dad to give to Junior would be, well, your dad was an idiot and the land vomited us out. And if you ever have a chance to get back there, don't ever do what we did. That would be the correct answer. But apparently the parents and the grandparents started to do, they answered their kids, well, God's not trustworthy, God's not fair. And God heard all of this and became very angry. And God sent the prophet Ezekiel and said to them, that this would be recorded in Ezekiel chapter 18 in verse 24 to 26, which says, but when a righteous man turns away from his righteousness, commits iniquity, and does according to all the abominations that a wicked man does, will he live? All the righteous deeds which he has done will not be remembered for his treachery which he has committed, and his sin which he has committed, for them he will die. Yet you say, the way of the Lord is not right. Hear now, O house of Israel, is my way not right? Is it not your ways that are not right? When a righteous man turns away from his righteousness, commits iniquity, and dies because of it, for his iniquity which he has committed, he will die. So God said to Israel, when I found you, you were like an abandoned newborn child. I found you deserted or whatever, and what did I do? I had grace, I had mercy, I had compassion for you. I raised you up, I planted you in a land floating with milk and honey, and then you turned around and stabbed me in the back, and then you sit there and say that I'm the one, I being God, that is not fair. God is saying, I am not the one who's being unfair in this deal. You are the ones who are not being fair. And throughout the Old Testament, we read that God is not a respecter of persons. This is a King James term which has the meaning that God is fair. God treats everyone alike. And so we have Peter questioning Jesus' fairness. I want to know what it is that I'm going to get out of this. We have Jesus who is going to present a parable about the fairness of God, and he is going to explain to us what does this meaning regarding the last will be first and the first will be last. All right, so we'll get into this parable now, verse 1 of chapter 20. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. Now, one of the most valuable crops in Israel was the grape harvest. It was used for medicinal purposes. During this time, they did not understand that certain drinking sources had parasites. All they knew is that sometimes they would drink water, they'd get very sick, or sometimes people would die from drinking the water. And they realized if they took fermented fruit juice and they poured it and mixed it with the water, it made the water safe to drink, because alcohol obviously kills bacteria and parasites. And so the grape harvest was a very valuable commodity to provide a means for safe drinking water. It was also used in social events and weddings and liturgy and religious ceremonies. And yet, even though it was a valuable commodity, it was a very difficult crop in which to harvest and bring to market. It was labor intensive. The location of the crops needed to be on the side of hills and mountains. Grapes needed a moderate climate. So Israel, is in a mountainous region. The grain crops are harvested on the valley floors, where the temperatures are warmer, but the grape harvests are done on the sides of hills and mountains, and there's a constant airflow, and cooler temperatures are needed to grow the grapes. And so the landowners would have laborers terrace off sections of the sides of the mountain in order to grow their plants, their vines. And this means that every year you had to haul fertilizer and topsoil up to the side of the mountain. And it was very labor intensive. It was also very difficult because they had a very small window time in order to harvest the grapes. The grapes would be ready in the beginning or the middle of September. And then like clockwork, when October struck, there was always a torrential downpour of rain. And if you did not harvest your grapes and get them off of the side of the mountain, it was likely that the grapes would be destroyed due to the rainy weather. So Jesus is telling us a parable about a guy who owns a vineyard. And so as we must keep in our minds, this is during the fall season of the grape harvest. There is a sense of urgency in the back of the mind of the landowner. He's very anxious to get his crop off of the side of the mountain before the torrential rains come. Now notice in verse 1 that the landowner went to the market. That's early in the morning. Now modern days, if you're working on a home improvement project, you'd likely go to Home Depot or Lowe's. You'd purchase your materials for the project, and then you would go out into the parking lot and you'd find a group of guys, typically they're illegal immigrants, and you would pull up to these guys, and you need a couple drywallers or electricians or someone who looks trustworthy. They hop in the back of your truck and you put them to work. You get your manpower usually there. Well, they didn't have Home Depot and Lowe's back in those days. In the first century, they had what was called the marketplace, and that's where the day laborers would go. They would await a rich landowner to show up, and understand that day laborers are the lowest of the low in the labor pool. They're the easiest to take advantage of. You can say, I'll give you $75 for the day. And at the end of the day, you can give them $20 and say, on you go. Well, they can't call the police because if they're illegal immigrants, they wouldn't take that kind of action. And so they were easy to take advantage of. So the Lord was aware that day laborers were easy targets to be taken advantage of. And so he codified in the law in the Old Testament that the payment of day laborers, it says in Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 13, you shall not oppress your neighbor nor rob him. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you all night until morning. In other words, you hire a guy, he comes to work. At the end of the day, before he leaves your farm, you're to pay him and put a paycheck in his hand. So, and not to put it off until the next day. Now, we have a landowner. He's looking for the least in the Jewish society. It's early in the morning. In this culture, the workday was at 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. So you had a 12-hour workday. If you went into the marketplace, it'd be 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning before the workday began. Again, he has a sense of urgency because of the type of crop that he wants to harvest, and he's looking for day laborers to accomplish his goal. Now we look at verse 2. After agreeing with the workers on 1 denarius for the day, he sent them into the vineyard. All right, and so here we see management, bargaining with laborers for the wage in exchange for their time and labor. They agreed to 1 denarius, which during this period of time was a very generous wage for a day labor. In fact, a Roman soldier or a skilled laborer would typically get 1 denarius. What this landowner is doing is he's offering these unskilled day laborers the same wage as a skilled laborer would get. And after all, how difficult is it to pick grapes? Anybody in the labor pool could actually do this. And so they were hired. They began to work on the side of the mountain at 6 o'clock in the morning. All right, verses 3 and 4. When he went out about 9 in the morning, he saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. To those men he said, "You also go to my vineyard, and I'll give you whatever is right." So off they went. All right, so the landowner's watching the progress, and still in the back of his mind, there's a sense of urgency. A quarter of the day has passed. He realizes that not a quarter of the harvest has been completed. He goes back to the labor pool, and he notices some guys have not yet been contracted. They're not interested in talking or negotiating money. They just wanted some work so they could bring home some food. And so we call these the 9 o'clock guys. So the 9 o'clock guys, they go over to the vineyard and they start joining the 6 o'clock guys. Now remember that Peter was wanting a contract from Jesus. He says he wanted like a verbal agreement as to what was in this for me. What am I going to get for working for you? So this 6 a.m. The 6 a.m. guys got the contract, but nobody else got the contract. Keep that in your mind. Verse 5, about noon and at 3, he went out again and did the same thing. So remember that there was a great sense of urgency to get this harvest completed. The work was not getting done. The day was passing quickly. And so he keeps going back to the labor pool to hire more. Verse 6, then about 5, he went and found others standing around and said to them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" So you have to, you have got 1 hour remaining in the workday. And so these 5 p.m., it's 5 p.m. He goes back to the labor pool. He finds more laborers. They want to be hired. They're standing idle. And so he says, "Why are you standing here idle?" Verse 7, because no one hired us, they said to him, "You also go to my vineyard," he told them. All right, so these 5 o'clock guys, nobody has hired them yet. They know that if they don't get something, they're not going to be able to bring food home. So think about how these 6 a.m. guys must be feeling about these 5 p.m. guys coming out. They've been out there all day long. They're tired, they're sweaty, they're dirty, their hands are cut up, their arms are scratched from the vines. And they've been working now for 11 hours and they're getting really tired. Along comes these 5 p.m. guys. They're excited and enthusiastic that they even got a job, no matter what they get paid. And they're working right next to these guys who are 6 a.m. guys that are already tired and worn out, and likely a bit grouchy by then. Now the day comes to the end. Verse 8, when evening came, the owner of the vineyard told his foreman, "Call the workers and give them their pay, starting with the last and ending with the first." Now you remember, Jesus said earlier, the last will be first and the first will be last. What in the world does that mean? Well, Jesus now gives us an example of what he was talking about in this parable. Obviously, the landowner was a godly man, an honorable man. He is consistent with Old Testament law. A day laborer is to receive their wages at the end of the day. And so he says to the business manager, line up the laborers, start with the 5 p.m. guys, work your way down to the 6 a.m. guys. And so those guys who were hired last are at the head of the line, and those who were hired first are at the end of the line for getting paid. Now verse 9. When those who were hired, about 5, came, each of them received 1 denarius. Now this is an act of generosity that was almost unheard of. He bargained with the 6 a.m. guys, work for me 12 hours and I'll pay you a denarius. The other guys clock in at 5 p.m. and they clock out at 6 p.m. and the landowner gives them the same 1 denarius. Now, likely word would start to spread down quickly through the line. Did you hear the 5 p.m. guys, they got a denarius, and so now the 6 a.m. guys are probably thinking, well, if the landowner gave them, the 5 p.m. guys, a denarius for 1 hour's work, it's likely I'm going to get paid 12 denarius for my 12 hours of work. And, they're probably thinking in their mind, well, I'm going to be wealthy now or rich. I'm going to have 12 denarius. I'm going to spend it on this, that, and the other. All right, now we got verse 10. So when the first ones came, they assumed they would get more, but they also received a denarius each. And so their assumptions were reasonable that they would get paid more than the 5 p.m. guys. They were expecting more. But they too just received a denarius. Now verses 11 and 12, when they received it, they began to complain to the landowner. These last men put in 1 hour, and you made them equal to us who bore the burden of the day and the burning heat. Now, when you are thinking that you are being taken advantage of, we have a tendency to pull out that poor me card and make our lives sound miserable and pitiful. We worked in the burning heat, we're all cut up and this and that. And so they began to pull that card out. The word burning heat in the Greek had the meaning of scorcher. So they begin to murmur, and they're insinuating the landowner is not being fair, much like what Peter was saying to Jesus. You mentioned treasure to the rich ruler, but you haven't mentioned treasure to me or the other disciples. Now, notice that the reply is to one of them. In other words, it appears that all the 6 a.m.ers got together kind of like a union would. They discussed it, and then they picked one to represent all of them to go speak to the landowner to confront him about the way he's paying the 6 a.m. guys and how he's allocating his money. And the fact that they didn't think it was fair. Now verse 13, he replied to one of them, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Didn't you agree with me on a denarius?" And so the landowner is saying, how is keeping my word making me into a bad guy? At the beginning of the day, you bargained, you contracted, you agreed to a denarius for 12 hours of work. The work is done, I'm paying you denarius. How does that make me wrong? Verses 14 through 16. Take that what's yours and go. I want to give the last man the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my business? Are you jealous because I'm generous? So the last will be first and the first last. Now the landowner is asking the 6 a.m. guys, are you upset with me because I keep my word? Are you upset with me because I'm generous? Are you upset with me because I'm compassionate for all of the workers? Are you upset with me because of my generosity? I'm not hurting you in the least. I'm keeping my commitment that we agreed to. And if I decide to be kind and generous to these other people over there, referring to the 5 p.m.ers, and I'm going to be a blessing to them, that doesn't make me wrong or dishonorable by me keeping my agreement that I made with you. The problem is, when it comes to the generosity of God, I want the generosity to be directed to me, and I don't need to see someone else getting generosity from God if I have a need. It's irritating to me. That's human nature. And so what he's saying here, doesn't the landowner have sovereignty over the land which he possesses, and he can do that with it what he pleases, whatever he wants to do? What he is telling us what is the parable about? What is this man telling us, and what is the parable about? All right, firstly, the landowner is God the Father, the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. He is sovereign. He can do with it whatever he wants to do. The vineyard is the kingdom. It is where the harvest is to be brought from. It is where the harvest is to be gathered. The laborers are Christians, Messianic Jews, believers. These are those people who are out there in the field being used by God. The day of work is time, and just as the landowner has a sense of urgency because of destruction, because of darkness that's coming, we too should have a sense of urgency, whether he is talking about the end of time or the end of your life as we know it in this world. It doesn't make a great deal of difference. The fact is that there should be a sense of urgency because you only have a certain number of days to live in this world. The evening is eternity, where we all go to receive our rewards. The wages are eternal life. The steward, the head of the operations for the land, is Jesus Christ, the one who will distribute the blessings of God. Jesus told us in John chapter 5, verse 22, "Furthermore, the Father judges no one, but has assigned all judgment to the Son." And so therefore, all eternal rewards are of grace. This is what we must continue to keep in the front of our minds. Am I upset with God because I believe he is somehow being unfair? Or is it my jealousy? Is it my envy? Is it my greed? What is this parable telling us? No matter where God calls you, if God calls you to an easy vineyard, and all of us here in America, we have an easy vineyard to work in. Not likely you're going to be called out to share the gospel in America and get shot for it. But if you're raised in Sri Lanka or North Korea or China or Iran, those are difficult vineyards. It doesn't matter if you're working in an easy vineyard or a difficult vineyard. It doesn't matter whether you were born in a Christian home or if you came to a saving knowledge late in your life. Jesus is saying salvation is all by grace. It's all because of Jesus Christ. If you were born in a Christian home and you have a strong faith your entire lifetime, what do you think that is? It's grace. And if you are in your final hour of life and you just accepted Jesus right before you take your last breath, what is that? That's grace. If you were a serial murderer and convicted, and yet you accepted Christ as your Lord and Savior, like the thief on the cross did, and then you die, what is that? That's grace. We are all recipients of grace. So don't be walking around thinking you're better than someone else or anyone else, or that you're more spiritual than anyone else. Don't go around as though you're the 6 a.m. guy or the 6 a.m. girl. You have nothing more than the 5 p.m. guy and the 5 p.m. gal. Don't talk to me. I've been out there for 11 hours. That's the wrong approach. That's the wrong attitude. The fact is, it's all by grace, and we need to ask ourselves, do I represent the same urgency which is in the heart of the vineyard owner? He is so focused and urgent so that none of his harvest will perish. Do I reflect the same level of urgency? Salvation is a gift of grace, and we must keep this sense of urgency in front of our minds moment by moment. The vineyard must be harvested before it's too late. We only have a short window of time to work the vineyard, and am I accomplishing that which the owner of the vineyard wants me to accomplish? And if the answer is no, I'm not, pray to God that he puts conviction in your heart and restores that sense of urgency to accomplish the work which he has contracted you and me to do for the kingdom. Amen? I hope this has been helpful and informative. Thank you for viewing.